Let's start. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Jessica. Welcome to our seminars. Today, we're going to have a presentation that is titled Hydrocarbon Producers and the Path to Mexico 2050. The presenter will be Jessica Frankis. Ms. Frankis is a chemical industry specialist in Deloitte supply chain practices. Previous to working at Deloitte, she worked for Exxon Chemical Company for 20 years, ExxonMobil, where she held a variety of senior level supply chain and sustainability roles with global responsibility. She's passionate about sustainability with a strong interest in reducing emissions of hard to abate industry, sustainable procurements, and circularity. In 2019, Jessica completed the World Business Council for Sustainable Development Leadership Program. She holds a chemical engineering, a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Texas, Austin. She lives in Houston with her husband and two sons. So I remember everybody, please, during the presentation to close the camera and the microphones. The only camera will be on will be Jessica. We will record it and you can ask your questions to the chat or request a question alive. Thank you, Jessica. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Carlos, for that introduction. I think you need to make me a presenter so I can share my screen.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Yes, right, great.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for having me here today. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak on this topic. One of the reasons I chose this topic is because, doing work with Deloitte right now, mostly in the oil, gas, and chemical space around, the lower emissions future. And one thing that has really become kind of more obvious or transparent to me now is that for the chemicals industry, it is an energy transition, right? The products that they're making are still going to be needed in 2050. So it's just finding a different lower emission way to make those same products. But for the industries farther upstream, our oil and gas producers and refiners, downstream companies, it's a bit more of an adaptation. It goes beyond transition. And so that's kind of what we're gonna talk about today. But before we jump in, just wanted to introduce myself a little bit here. As you have noticed maybe by my last name, I am married to a Venezuelan. Jose and I married in 2008, where we met in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. As Carlos mentioned, I have a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. And previous to working for Deloitte Consulting, which I started in November, I worked for ExxonMobil for 20 years. And then a game changer for me in my career, I would say, was participating in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development Leadership Program, which I did in 2019, which really kind of opened my eyes to the world of sustainability, which had always been a personal passion, but not as much of a professional passion. And really gave me kind of more the framework and words to talk about this topic. As you can see in the top picture, I have made one trip with my husband and my oldest son, who was 16 months at the time, to Venezuela. We visited Caracas and Valencia, where he's from, as well as Margarita Island. So beautiful, beautiful country. Would much love the opportunity to be able to go back and take our children one day. All right, so our agenda for today, first we'll just talk about what does net zero mean for hydrocarbon demand. And we'll do that by looking at, the energy emissions by industry and then the sources of energy by industry. And then we'll move more into kind of that adaptation piece of this, which is how can hydrocarbon producers adapt? And so first we'll talk about the actual technologies and products that will be part of the net zero future. And then we'll talk more on the business side. So what are some business models for getting to 2050? And then we'll kind of just wrap it up with some key messages. Before I dive in here, I do want to tell a little bit of maybe a personal story. So a couple years ago, I read a book about impacts to humanity and the Earth in 2100 from climate change at the various scenarios. So, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, what that would mean. Honestly, it was quite scary, and it makes you feel a little helpless maybe because the problem is so big, right? And recently, my 8-year-old asked me, he's always asking very interesting questions, but he asked me if he would be alive in 2100 for the turn of the century, when all of this stuff is supposed to have, come to fruition. And I told him yes, with a smile on my face, because he was just asking randomly out of the blue, not in regards to climate change, but it was kind of sad to think about what the world, could be like for him if there's no action. So, now that I'm working with companies and organizations to get to this net zero emissions by 2050, which is, hopefully a below two degree scenario here, it gives me some hope and more importantly, maybe a sense of control. And, knowing that I should be alive in 2050 and I'll get to see if we did it or not. So personally for me, that makes me feel a lot better about the whole situation. And to know that I'll hopefully know what sort of world I'm leaving for my children. I am an optimist, so I'm banking on the fact that we make it happen. So, all right. So there's a lot of reports out there that talk about the energy transition to get to net zero 2050. This is just a small sample of them. Most of them talk about what the energy supply landscape looks like and not necessarily how industries will adapt to meet that supply or that demand. So that's what we're really going to be focusing on today, specifically for hydrocarbon producers. We are a carbon-based world, and so carbon will always be needed. The thing that will change is maybe where it comes from and how we process it. And then as far as all of these different reports and scenarios go, for today, I've chosen to focus on the IEA Net Zero 2050 report, mostly because that is a global report and we have a global group here today, and it's focused on sources of energy. So that's the one that we're going to kind of dive into for the first part of this presentation. So if you think about, where are the emissions, how are they going to decline between now and 2050? You can see in the graph on the right that they go to zero, right? Like that's the name of the scenario, net zero 2050. The reason it's net zero is that, there are still some emissions from fossil fuels in 2050, but they are all offset, either by nature or direct air capture. So, this scenario is how do we get to that zero? And if you look at the graph on the left, these are the emissions by industry. And so you can see all of them getting close to zero, but not quite to zero, as we see on the right. And then, obviously it's the pace that differs among the industries, and it's not the same. So electricity leads the way. That's the industry that has already begun the transition and will underpin the transition of some of the other industries. The rapid deployment of more energy efficient technologies, electrification of end uses, and swift growth of renewables all play a central part in reducing emissions across all the sectors. So by 2050, nearly 90% of all electricity generation is from renewables, and around 25% of non-electric energy use in industry and buildings. So we can see electricity is critically important here, but there's also a major role for emerging fuels and technologies, notably hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels, bioenergy, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, especially in sectors where emissions are often most challenging to reduce. We call these hard to abate industry. So cement and steel, as well as chemicals and refining, are all hard to abate industries. So where is this energy coming from? Well, it's not really from fossil fuels. So by the time we get to 2050, fossil fuel supply will have gone from 80% of our energy needs, which is what it is today, to about 20%. The use does not fall to zero, though. There are still significant amounts used in producing non-energy goods, in plants with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and in sectors where emissions are especially hard to abate, right? So we're going to dive more into those details in a little bit. But you can see how the brown, the red, the purple, which is our main fossil fuels today, kind of peak during this decade and then fall off towards 2050. So pretty much by 2050, unabated fossil fuels, so that's fossil fuels without carbon capture or some other technology to capture the emissions, are predominantly replaced by electricity. So electricity will supply 45% of the energy needs for both industry and transportation. And industry, of the sectors here, industry is still the most reliant on fossil fuels compared to the other two. And you can also see hydrogen really taking off as a fuel source in the transportation industry. So, what replaces fossil fuels? They are replaced by other lower emission fuel sources where electrification is not possible. So you're going to see modern bioenergy and hydrogen-based fuels become more of the fuel sources. And we still have solid, liquid, and gaseous fuels, and they play an important role. We see a large increase in bioenergy and hydrogen. Around 40% of bioenergy used today is for the traditional use of biomass in cooking. This is rapidly phased out for net zero 2050. And modern forms of solid biomass, which we'll get into more later, can be used to reduce emissions in both the electricity and industry sectors. So this modern biomass increases, it pretty much more than doubles from 2020 to 2050. And that offsets a large portion of the coal demand. And then the use of low emission liquid fuels, such as ammonia, synthetic fuels, and liquid biofuels increases, not quite an order of magnitude, but pretty close. So from 3.5 exajoules in 2020 to just above 25 in 2050. And then on the gas side, the low emission gases such as hydrogen, synthetic methane, biogas, and biomethane rise from just 2 exajoules, so pretty insignificant in 2020, to 50 exajoules in 2050. So this is a huge expansion of these products. And just for a comparison, the increase in gaseous hydrogen production from 2020 to 2030, so just within this decade, is twice as fast as the fastest 10-year increase in shale gas production in the United States. So expecting really big things from hydrogen as that becomes a more mature technology. And we're really starting to see that in the US. We just had the infrastructure bill passed the end of last year, which had $10 million in it for hydrogen alone. So fossil fuels, as we've said, will still be used, but mostly in conjunction with abatement technologies. And they're still needed because there are some chemical products that need to be made, and they need to be made from fossil fuels and other non-energy uses. So by the time we get to 2050, the burning of fossil fuels becomes pretty rare. And the overall demand drops for oil alone will drop to about 1/4 of what it is today. So today, I think it's around 90 million barrels per year, and in 2050, it's around 24. So if you look at these graphs, the one on the left is the unabated fossil fuel, and you can see by 2050, that's pretty much all but gone for a few specific uses, and we'll talk about those some on the next slide. And then you have these low emission sources. So you can still see some fossil fuel use in the low emission sources, but that is tied to abatement technologies like carbon capture. So the fossil fuels that we're still using in 2050 will serve three primary purposes. So non-energy applications, and this usage actually increases from what it is today to 2050. And so that is in chemical products, durable goods, that sort of thing. And 70% of oil is used in applications where it's not combusted. Other examples include lubricants, paraffin waxes, and asphalts. So there are major efforts to limit fossil fuel use in these applications. For instance, global plastic collection rates for recycling rise from 15% today to 55% in 2050. Also using fossil fuels with CCUS, so carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Around half of fossil fuel use in 2050 is in plants equipped with this technology. And also the conversion of natural gas to hydrogen with CCUS is another major technology that comes into play. And then finally, use in sectors where technology options are scarce. So the remaining 20% of fossil fuel use in 2050 comes from sectors where the complete elimination of emissions is particularly challenging. Mostly this fossil fuel that's being used is oil, as it continues to fuel aviation in particular. So we've seen a lot about sustainable aviation fuels, but the ability to supply the demand is probably not totally there by 2050. And then we have the unabated use of fossil fuel. It results in about 1.7 gigatons of CO2 emissions in 2050, which are fully offset by BECCS, which is bioenergy carbon capture, and then direct air carbon capture. Okay, so that kind of wraps up, what the energy sources and demand look like by 2050. And so we've mentioned a few technologies and products here that become really important in this scenario. So in the next section, we're going to focus on those and how they relate to the assets and the competencies and capabilities that hydrocarbon producers have. So here we're still looking at the net zero report from the IEA, and emissions reduction occurs primarily through some key technologies. So electricity, as we've discussed, from renewables is a key one. But the other three key ones are hydrogen, bioenergy, and CCUS. So I've mentioned those a few times. We're going to dive into those in a little bit more detail. Before I do, I wanted to cover some of the other emissions reductions mitigation measures that you see on this slide. So one that you see here is behavior. And so what does that mean exactly? And it's more of what we've been doing. So reducing excessive or wasteful energy use, transport mode switching. So going from, single passenger vehicles to buses or bicycling or even to EVs. The transition to EVs does require a consumer behavior switch. And then also materials efficiency gains. And that's around recycling and reuse, which obviously requires us as humans to either reuse things or put them into the proper recycling bins. So behavior still plays a role here. The other one is energy efficiency. So many efficiency measures in industry. So we have energy management systems, best-in-class industrial equipment like electric motors, variable speed drives, heaters, and grinders. All of this is installed by 2050. And process integration options such as waste heat recovery are exploited to their maximum economic potentials. Also, stringent fuel economy standards and ensuring no new passenger cars running on internal combustion engines are sold globally from 2035. So that results in a rapid shift in vehicle sales towards much more efficient EVs. So all of this in the scenario is put into effect and scaled up very quickly. And so, you see this more in this first time frame than in the second one. Also, a lot of the reason energy efficiency may not play a bigger role is because it does have kind of diminishing returns. So a lot of the things that we have done already in the past, we can't really repeat. So once you become as energy efficient as you can, that's kind of the end of the road. So you have to start switching away from energy sources that emit carbon dioxide. Also, as we discussed, electrification of assets and transportation, very important. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on that later on. And then, of course, wind and solar as the sources of those electrification of assets and transportation, also very important. So the first technology that we'll go into is hydrogen, and hydrogen becomes very important as a fuel source, and not just a fuel source for transportation, as is mostly discussed right now, but also as a fuel source for industry. So the predominant sources of hydrogen production are from coal and gas with CCUS in electrolysis. And by 2050, 25% of hydrogen production occurs in industrial facilities. So these are the kinds of facilities that, you know, I used to work in and many of you work in now. And global hydrogen use expands, as we said, from less than 90 million tons in 2020 to more than 200 million tons in 2030. And the proportion of low carbon hydrogen rises from 10% in 2020 to 70% in 2030. So low carbon hydrogen is kind of anything but the gray variety. We have lots of colors these days, so we try to just talk about low carbon versus all the different colors. So around half of low carbon hydrogen produced globally in 2030 comes from electrolysis, and the remainder from coal and natural gas with CCUS. So this varies substantially by regions, but globally that's kind of the breakout. And then hydrogen is also blended with natural gas in gas networks for something called fuel switching. So the global average blend in 2030 includes 15% of hydrogen in volumetric terms, which reduces CO2 emissions from gas consumption by around 6%. So this is something you'll see in refineries around boilers and furnaces. Of the 530 metric tons of hydrogen produced in 2050, around 25% is produced within the industrial facilities, as I mentioned, and the remainder is what's called merchant hydrogen. So this is hydrogen produced by one company to sell to others, similar to what we have today with companies like Air Liquide or Linde. Almost 30% of the low carbon hydrogen used in 2050 takes the form of hydrogen-based fuels, which include ammonia and synthetic liquids and gases. We'll get into a little more on the actual process of that on the next slide. And then an increasing share of hydrogen production comes from electrolyzers, which account for 60% of the total production in 2050. This is kind of a technology that comes online later, more in the decades closer to 2050. The electrolyzers must be powered by grid electricity that's dedicated to renewables in order for that to be a low carbon source. And then we also have other low carbon sources of energy, such as nuclear power, that can power the electrolyzers. So I won't go into all the details here on this slide, but it's just meant to illustrate how hydrogen becomes a fuel product. And so there are various processes out there today: methanation, methanol synthesis, Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, and Haber-Bosch, that gives us different varieties of hydrogen fuel products. So there's synthetic methane, methanol, synthetic liquid fuels, ammonia, and liquid organic hydrogen carriers. These is really for the transportation of the hydrogen itself. So a lot of detail here. Not really going to go into this now, but just wanted to illustrate, how do you get from hydrogen to a fuel product? So the second technology that is really key for the future that relates to hydrocarbon producers is bioenergy. And one of the key advantages here is that bioenergy can use existing infrastructure that we have today. So for example, biomethane can use existing natural gas pipelines and the same end user equipment, while many drop-in liquid biofuels can use existing oil distribution networks and be used in vehicles with only minor or limited alterations. Bio-LPG, which is derived from renewable feedstocks, is identical to conventional LPG, and so it can be blended and distributed in the same way. And then liquid biofuel consumption, so if we're looking here at the graph, it rises from 1.6 million barrels of oil equivalents per day in 2020 to 6 in 2030. And then after 2030, it grows a little bit slower to around 7. So this is another technology that's expected to contribute more in the front end of this scenario. The use shifts to shipping and aviation as electricity increasingly dominates road transport. And then almost half of the liquid biofuel use in 2050 is for aviation, where biokerosene accounts for around 45% of total fuel use in aircraft. We also have bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. That's the acronym BECCS. And that plays a critical role in the net zero scenario in offsetting emissions from sectors where the full elimination of emissions is difficult. So in 2050, around 10% of total bioenergy is used in facilities equipped with CCUS, and about 1.3 gigatons of CO2 is captured using this technology. Around 45% of this CO2 is captured in biofuels production, 40% in the electricity sector, and the rest in heavy industry, notably cement production. So I keep saying modern bioenergy, maybe wondering what that is and how it's different. So this is just a quick table on the modernization and evolution of biomass. So the production of biofuels is continually improving, both in type of feed and the process used. So we have our first generation fuels here, which come from sugar crops, oil crops, so things like corn and vegetable oil, and a combination of those. And you can see, the processes used were fermentation, transesterification, primarily. In our second generation biofuels, most of these are generated from lignocellulosic materials. And we also see more variation or maturity in the technologies used. So we have gasification, synthesis, and catalytic cracking. Also some anaerobic digestion here. Third generation biofuels, which is what my previous employer was working on, come from algae, require some genetic modification, and then use the process of transesterification to actually make the fuel. So our final technology here, applicable to the hydrocarbon industry, is CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. And this is really an enabling technology for the continued use of fossil fuels until CO2 utilization technologies are mature. In my opinion, CO2 utilization, that's really the holy grail, right? And then carbon becomes a renewable thing. But 30% of CO2 capture comes from fuel supply by 2050. And in this scenario, 95% of the captured CO2 actually remains in storage. Global hydrogen use, so obviously this technology depends on your geographic area and whether or not you have the capabilities to actually store the carbon in geologic formations. So of these technologies that I've discussed, many of them, the technology may be mature, but it's still not commercialized, or in the case of hydrogen, the technology is really not even that mature yet, especially when you're talking about green hydrogen. So what is it going to take for us to get to these mature technologies? We like to actually use this example of the global lithium-ion battery because it is a chemical engineering example, just like our processes. And it shows that, rapid development can occur. So what you're seeing on this graph is the cost to output on the left here for global lithium ion batteries. And so in the first phase of the learning curve, there was a cost performance reduction of 87%, and that was over just 10 years. And on the right, you see the growth in the market once the cost came down enough. And so in the second phase, there was an additional 90% reduction over the next 20 years to get to where we are today. And you can see some of the market milestones here. So Tesla Model S on there, and now the Tesla Gigafactory. So rapid technology development can happen, and it does need to happen. And so it can present growth and value opportunities that are needed for these step functions to get us where we need to be. One other thing I just kind of wanted to throw out there around these different technologies and products is, as you're looking at your facilities, some of your assets, based on which one of these technologies or products you're shifting towards, may no longer be needed, and you may need a different asset base. So as you're looking, at your investment portfolios or maintenance schedules, turnarounds, that sort of thing, as we get further down the road, some of these assets may no longer be needed. And newer assets like pyrolysis and electrolyzers will come online. So that covers the products and technologies that align with the hydrocarbon industry's kind of infrastructure and expertise. And so the next part of this presentation is kind of what sort of business models can be used to make this adaptation to 2050. And before we jump into that, just kind of want to set the stage a little bit here with the recent crude dynamics. And if you continued this graph on to show today, it would be even more fluctuating with crude over 100 barrels again. But we've been from peak to sub-zero prices. There's been inelastic to elastic demand. We've seen the shale boom to shale pain. The world's biggest IPO was Saudi Aramco to mass bankruptcies. So the 2010s really had it all. And so it's not really just the energy transition that has some of our stakeholders and shareholders wanting to know if these companies should change portfolios, but also, just these changing dynamics around crude may prompt some to shift away from the oil and gas portfolios that they have today. We also know that many of these companies are very slow to change, and so the change transformation really needs to start now because it could take a decade to turn these ships. Also want to talk about some myths around portfolio optimization before we get into the different archetypes that we have. And so this was some research done by Deloitte, and they really kind of proved that 5 myths around how you think about your portfolio and your strategy aren't necessarily true. So myth 1 is that only 16% of companies is that agility and flexibility always delivers gains. And what was found was that really only 16% of companies that made frequent changes landed in the top quartile of performance, while almost 40% were below average. So the frequent changes actually kind of erodes shareholder trust, and companies that seemed more strategic and deliberate in their choices actually yielded better results. Myth 2 is that being big and integrated is better. And what the research found was that 70% of large and integrated companies, and large in this case means revenues above 10 billion, delivered around average performance. So the cons of this strategy are beginning to outweigh the pros. Of the large companies in here, actually the NOCs outperformed, so the national oil companies outperformed their publicly traded counterparts. Myth 3 is that oil has lost its luster. So 2/3 of oil-heavy portfolios delivered above average performance. And just to replace annual consumption and natural field declines to get to 2030, 525 billion of annual capital investment is needed. So, we saw before by 2050, it's 24 million barrels per day of oil that's needed, but that decline doesn't really start until the 2030s. So in 2030, the oil demand is still projected to be around 87 million barrels per day, which is very similar to what it is now. Myth 4 is that every green shift in portfolios is scalable. So only 9% of portfolios that became greener are in the top quartile. A lot of these technologies are really new and a bit riskier. So although it's necessary in the mid to long term to move towards these, it's important to strike a right balance between green and hydrocarbon. And the benefits are seen when these investments are complementary to their core business. Myth 5 is that shale's pain makes all other portfolio options an obvious choice. So what the research revealed here was that 18 to 45% of non-shale portfolios were suboptimal or performed below average, and no particular portfolio shined. So not conventional heavy, not offshore deep water. It wasn't really play specific. It's more about how you drill than where you drill. So these are a few myths that we've now busted. So when you start thinking about the future of your company and how you'll play, just to know that these things aren't necessarily true. It's really about optimizing on your core strengths and competencies. So these are the 4 archetypes for the futures. And another thing is that, uncertainty in decision making is okay. It's going to be part of this next decade as we bring on new technologies, but you just need to understand what your choices are. So uncertainty is fine, but confusion, not really. Also to keep in mind that oil and electricity are both commodities, but with different risk and return profiles. So the first category or archetype that we have here is called stalwarts. And these are the ones that will take the last barrel out of the ground. And they will gain market share, in oil and gas, however, of a shrinking market. And this archetype will really benefit from geographies with low regulatory risk. The next archetype that we have here is called producers, and they will decarbonize their process, i.e. through electrification of assets, CCS, or low carbon hydrogen. The green followers will also make the new energy transition, but on more of an extended timeline than our next one that we'll get into, which is the pioneers. But they will optimize for cash flow to be able to invest in green when it's more mature. And then lastly, we have our green energy pioneers, which will lead the way and are very necessary for the transition. This one has the most risk, but also the most upside potential and green market share. So obviously to all of these choices, there's a balance between trade-offs and metrics. And the metrics that you use can create distinct recipe for success. Each archetype has to do something around ESG. That is true for all of them. And they all need to prioritize between capital and cash flow targets, risk return trade-offs, the scope evaluations, and growth. But how they do that is what creates the distinct recipes for success. Like I said, ESG is critical to all of these. So that's environmental, social, and governance. And reporting, is going to also be critical as we go forward, and transparency. And for all the archetypes, how they redeploy their capital and the strategy around that is key. That's really true for any change, not just this one. So here's a little bit more on our net zero pioneers. They're the ones that are going to transition from an oil company to an energy company. We're already seeing this in the market with a lot of the European majors, primarily Shell and BP. They will use divestments or asset realizations and reallocation of future capital to fund this. And they'll pull that money away and they'll sell those assets in cases where there have low return projects. And they will create the biggest valuation uplift. Then right behind them, we have our green followers, which seems maybe more of what the US majors are doing. And they're also more focused on low carbon solutions rather than renewables. So things like CCS and hydrogen. Another thing to keep in mind is that, and this really shows here in this archetype, that reserves are no longer a key metric for shareholders. One of the habits I created towards the end of my time with ExxonMobil was listening to each of the quarterly shareholder meetings. And you really learn what is important, not really during the presentation, but after that, when all of the investors and kind of the street, if you will, are asking their questions. And what I observed is that very few are actually asking about reserves, and they're all asking about capital allocation and things related to ESG strategy. So the reserves to production is reduced by year. That determines how fast you follow kind of the green pioneers. So the more aggressive you are in reducing your reserves, kind of the more free cash flow that you will have to invest in green technologies. You know, if we look on this table here at the different prices of oil, you can see some pretty significant numbers. And then of course, with today's prices, it just makes that cash flow accumulate even faster. So here we have our low carbon producers. So the name of the game here is really being lean, being operationally efficient, and doing some decarbonization to achieve the right portfolio. If all the companies follow the recognized best practices for drilling and completion, their free cash flow could increase 155%. So the average free cash flow would be actually higher than the max of what it is today. Likewise, on the right, if best practices for carbon dioxide intensity reduction were followed, that would reduce emissions from 45 to 60%, depending on your play here. So you can see the oil sands, other onshore, offshore shelf, offshore deep water, and then shale or tight oil. But still a significant reduction. So our final archetype here are the hydrocarbon stalwarts. So someone, somewhere, will remove the last barrel of oil from the ground. And an interesting concept that I saw recently was that all the carbon we need already exists above ground. So it's just a matter of developing the technologies to economically access it and kind of make that a circular thing. So here we have the lower value ones and the higher value ones, and how they can move towards this. So having less than 16% of their hydrocarbon portfolio at risk from decline in cash flows and recoverable reserves helps increase the market share of stalwarts to 51% by 2050. So for the non-NOCs, North America is actually in the best position here. And for the NOCs, obviously Middle East is the best positioned here. And both of those are due, or really the Middle East is due to low regulatory risk. So in each of these scenarios, there's a way, or archetypes, there's a way to maximize opportunities and minimize risk. So for our net zero pioneers, technology is key and collaboration across the ecosystem is necessary. I never really heard this word ecosystem much until I became a consultant, but I would say the difference here is that it's more than just the value chain, which is what we typically think about, you know, so your suppliers, your own operations, your customers, it goes beyond that, and collaborating with, you know, other technology providers, other suppliers, you know, maybe governments, just in very different ways than what we see today, because of the nature of these new technologies. Our green followers, they will wait to adopt some of these technologies, but not too long. These companies will be key to the commercialization of technologies and the economies of scale that make them affordable. Another thing that green followers can focus on, if it's one of their current core competencies, is trading. And they'll be doing more than building free cash flow. They need to build capabilities, and they need to have a trusted strategy before executing. For our low carbon producers, they're going to unlock value by being efficient and showing value to their customers for being low carbon. They will have increased ESG scrutiny, and that will need to be managed as a risk. And then finally, our stalwarts. So for the opportunities, it doesn't mean that their portfolio doesn't change. They need to be looking for new markets, lower cost feedstocks, and investments that build on strengths. A risk here is that they can become unattractive to investors. So they'll need to be able to articulate the necessity of fossil fuels for the transition. And most importantly, they will need to be a responsible operator. So license to operate, critically important here. So we've talked about the different markets, opportunities, and risk to each of these options. But this slide is more about how do you actually make it happen, what needs to happen internally, and what capabilities are needed within the organization to make each of these successful. So we have here 4 key internal capabilities: operations, digital mindset, workforce, and the supply chain ecosystem. So for the pioneers, it's really all about the new, which means they need to have agility in operations. And it's not just new green technologies, but also digital innovation that is critically important. They will need workers with new capabilities and, of course, new supply chains and even new value chains. For our green followers, navigating the transition is key, and finding that right opportunity to move towards green and that right time is going to be important. They'll use cash to get the most value, and they'll need an organization that can bridge both markets, so they'll need to be very flexible. Their supply chains will also be of a hybrid nature. For our producers, our low carbon producers, engineering and design excellence is very important. They will need to have ways in the digital space for carbon monitoring, and also carbon, not just in their own operations, but also in their supply chains. And then for our stalwarts, as mentioned, operational excellence and license to operate is very important. Their digital focus needs to be on reliability and health, safety, and environment. Talent attraction here will be key. And for their supply chain partners, they need to be true and trusted partners. So just to kind of wrap all of this up, the key message here is really that the 2020s is a decade of uncertain decision, but really not a time to wait and see. So this is the time when you know, the shifts need to be made and the strategies need to be finalized to be ready for the coming decades. As mentioned, oil demand is steady through this decade, which gives most of these companies some time to figure these things out. And then the status quo, eventually will result in irrelevancy. And then, of course, ESG is critical for all. All right. Thank you. That concludes.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for this very, very interesting approach that I'm sure is going to cause the reflection between our teams. I really like your concept of the 5 myths and also how they divide the different companies, different characteristics, and I'm trying to see how Venezuela will fit into those 4 categories. So it's very interesting, your presentation. I think we're really gonna. There is several questions in the chat, so I'm gonna start with a question. And let me go back here. The first question is regarding recent technology development in small nuclear and thorium reactors for electricity generation. What are your expectations about future increase of this technology beyond current predictions?
I am really not qualified to answer this question. I don't have deep knowledge in the nuclear space. Really what I would say is to make the transition happen, we need all of the things. Like, there's nothing that we should be giving up on at this point. And so nuclear is definitely going to play a role. As far as these specific types of nuclear, can't really speak to that.
Okay. The other question is, how does hydrogen help if currently blue and brown hydrogen contribute more emission than gas?
Yes, this is definitely true. Hydrogen is one of the most carbon intense building blocks that we have in the chemical industry. So really we have to move towards these new ways of making hydrogen. So either green hydrogen or blue hydrogen with CCUS and renewable energy also gets you to a low carbon hydrogen.
Okay. The next one is, what rapid and widespread changes in policy and investment across many sectors of society, including government, industry, and individuals, would care to kindly prioritize? Would you care to kindly prioritize, please?
So for me, I think the single most important thing that governments can do is to create a price on carbon. I think that is critically important. Because what we see in the markets right now, sure, there are some companies that are willing to pay for CO2 sequestration, but until there's an actual price on CO2, there's not really going to be a robust market for that. So I definitely think that is the most important thing. The other thing that needs to happen is regulations, standards around all of these technologies, right? So for hydrogen, for instance, if we're going to have pipelines and transport just like we do for some of our other gases, what are the purity expectations there? What are the safety standards? All of these things need to be developed across these technologies, and just like we have today for natural gas and gasoline pipelines, that sort of thing.
Regarding to that answer, do you see? I'm concerned about carbon bonus market for carbon bonus. Do you see a rapid development of this in the near future?
I only see a rapid development if there's some sort of government mandate of a price on carbon.
Okay. And the next question is, any idea of the remaining CO2 emission budget, if any, by using electrolysis or biokerosene using air transportation?
Any of the remaining CO2.
You can see that. I don't.
Yes, I'm reading it. I'm trying to
Good.
for bio. I'm not sure what is meant by remaining CO2 emission budget.
Uh, Let me ask Juan. Juan, what do you mean by remaining emission? 30 seconds.
There should be, I mean,
We cannot hear
from using hydrogen, whatever source it is, to produce kerosene for air transportation, there must be some kind of a balance between, the emissions of the lack of emissions for producing hydrogen and the emissions from air transportation with kerosene from hydrogen. Being net zero, which means that you save so much CO2 from using electrolysis as you emit emissions from air transportation. I mean, how much is that a net zero possibility? Is it positive or negative?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact balance, but another thing that comes into play here for some of these other biokerosenes, right, is that you're using biofeeds, which actually have carbon offsets as they're grown. So that's how some of this happens. And then we also saw, aviation is actually one of the sectors that does not get to net zero, but it's offset by the use of direct air capture and some of this bioenergy that I just mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next question is the data from OPEC and other technical outlets and scientists indicate that fossil fuel demand will continue even past 2060. Also, the lack of investment in renewable at the level required to reach the 2-degree target will force countries to continue to use fuels, in particular in developing economies like India. How do you reconcile both? It seems inevitable that we will not meet the target of less 2 degrees centigrade by 2050. What do you think?
Yes, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm an optimist. So I like to think that humanity will get there. I agree. Like all of the climate denial that happened since the 70s has definitely not put us in a great place. We could have been where we are now 20 years ago if that hadn't happened, which would give us a much more reasonable timeline to make all of these things happen. As far as the OPEC data goes and other technical outlets, yes, there are many different scenarios out there. Even the one we were looking at today, it doesn't go to zero, right? There's still 24 million barrels of demand per day. I think the main message here is the shift to electricity, especially in the transportation sector and in some industrial applications as well. And that the demand for hydrocarbons or for oil and gas will decrease. Exactly what that decrease is, hard to say. And so for those companies still producing oil and gas, not necessarily in 2030, but in 2040 and 2050, you're going to be competing for the lowest cost, most efficient producer. And so, what you need to think about is your company set up to be that? Are you a low cost producer of oil and gas? So that's the first part of the question. Definitely developing economies like India is where the struggle is. I mean, to be honest though, it's really about the US and China, at least at the moment. Those are the two most important countries for this. And the rate that we are asking China to decarbonize is quite significant. So that really is the biggest challenge as they grow, in my mind.
Thank you. The next question is: the scenarios developed are deterministic, and most of them only focus on the supply side. So far, little have been done to create the necessary incentives on the demand side. How and who are you going to provide incentives for all these things to happen? Do you know if the economic feasibility of the different technology has been considered in developing the scenario?
Okay. Yes, I definitely agree with the first statement, which is kind of why I spun up this presentation in this way, right? So we did talk some about the demand, but as far as you say the necessary incentives on the demand side, I think this really goes back to the carbon price. That is definitely maybe a draconian way to do it, but probably the most effective. The other shift that we're seeing that's more of a market-driven way to do this is what's called sustainable procurement. So, you know, for instance, you have a company that's a brand owner or an automotive manufacturer, some company that's more consumer-facing, right? They want to increase their brand reputation by reducing their emissions, and a lot of them are making scope 3 emissions target reduction claims, right? So in order to do that, that whole reduction target filters upstream. And so as a company, you know, as an automotive company goes to purchase parts, you know, plastic parts, for instance, for the car, they're going to ask those suppliers, what's the carbon footprint of this material? And then, you know, those OEMs are going to go ask the producers of the plastic, what's the carbon footprint of the material? And we're starting to see that slowly trickle upstream or up the value chain, if you will. So that's a more market-based way that this is happening. It's not so much an incentive per se as, you know, we're seeing procurement bids being won or lost based on the sustainability or carbon footprint aspects of a company's product. And then the last part of this question, so the economic feasibility of the different technologies has been considered in developing the scenarios. So there are different ways to do that, and most of them use what's called Wright's Law as a way to model that. You can also do scenario-based modeling based on how you think industry, governments are going to react. So this is a single scenario, so I'm sure they just picked one set of variables for that. But in like the IPCC scenarios that you see, that's where they're looking at different aspects of regulations, demand, behavior to develop the different scenarios.
Thank you, Jessica. Let me combine a couple of questions. The first one is what part of what country will be able to afford renewable energy? And the other is the scenario seems possible for country with a strong economy, but how do you see the scenario in developing country economy that is in subsistence? You know, rich and poor. How do you see it?
Yeah, so I mean, we've definitely seen the price of renewable energy decrease significantly. And, you know, this is my own personal metaphor here. I think about the telephone, right? So when the telephone first came out, it was only in rich countries. You had to put up these poles and string these lines, and, you know, they're only in more urban areas. Then in the late 90s, the cell phone became prevalent, and you saw entire countries just skip a part of that evolution, right? Like they never had telephone poles and lines. They went straight to the cell phone. And now the cell phone, you know, they may not even have computers. They just have cell phones. They have computers in their hands. They never had a desktop or maybe even a laptop. So I kind of liken this technology evolution to the cell phone in that way. Personally, if you're looking at a small rural place in Latin America, you know, a hard to reach city with, or town really, with only a couple people, personally, it seems a lot easier to me to go set up a few solar panels to give them electricity versus, you know, stringing wires all the way from a coal burning power plant. So I do see some advantages to renewables in that way, similar to the way that the cell phone proliferated.
Thank you. Yes. Any perception of possible new reality paradigms beyond the 5 myths of portfolio optimization? I like that myth, the third one. Go ahead.
I don't know on this one. I mean, I think the point of the myths is really to say, like, there's not a silver bullet or a golden arrow, right? There's not just one thing that you can bank on, or a single answer. It's really important to just look at your own companies. What are your core strengths? What things do you really have going for you? And try to optimize based on those core strengths.
Any perception on time frame for energy technology development follow the path from stalwarts to pioneers?
On time frame.
I don't understand it.
Yeah, it's really, so the time frame difference comes into play with the green followers versus the net zero pioneers, right? So those two have probably similar portfolios, but the green followers, like their name says, are going to wait till the technology is a bit more mature and proven before they invest. For the other two, the low carbon producers and the stalwarts, technology is still important, but it's different kinds of technology, right? So it's looking at taking your current assets and making those more efficient or lower carbon, depending on which one of those archetypes.
You know, I was, when you were explaining this, it came to my mind that the net zero and the green forward will be more in developing countries or companies that operate in developing countries, and the low carbon and the stalwart will be in company like non-development company with a lot of reserves on the ground, like Middle East. I include Venezuela here. Is that's like a, you agree with that? I mean,
I think you could generally agree with that, but like anything, there are exceptions to the rules. So I think, like Saudi Aramco, they may play a couple of these roles. To be honest, they're already getting into hydrogen, and they're also already getting into CCS. So they are using backhaul economics. So they will send products to, let's say, South Korea, Japan, whatever, and then they will send gas, and then they'll refill those same ships with carbon dioxide and then bring it back and sequester it. So yeah, I think generally that's probably true, but with some of the bigger NOCs, you may see more diversification.
okay. What is your feeling about real commitment from the major oil companies to reduce CO2 emissions?
Yes. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think we are starting to see some real commitment, at least verbally. But since a lot of these technologies are still new, there's still not steel in the ground, which I think is kind of your point here, right? So it's still a lot of talk and not a lot of investment at this point. I think the next 5 years here is where we're going to see that shift happen from talk to not just talk, but also talk and strategies and investment.
The next question is, you say something that caught my attention also. You say that all the oil is in the surface. I understand that what you meant is that all the oil that we need right now have been discovered.
Well, actually, I said all the carbon, not oil.
I understood. Okay,
at least I hope. That's what I meant to say.
All the oil, okay, maybe if all the oil that is needed is already at the surface, why are companies still doing exploration and doing drilling? Case Guyana, Namibia, etc., and they're just going to leave on the ground? It's 250 just too near for some of these companies.
Yeah, so maybe I said oil, and I apologize if I did. So what I meant to say was carbon. So like all the carbon that we need is already above ground. The trick is making it circular, right? And we don't have technologies and processes today that can do that, right? Or even supply chains that can do that. So that's the part that still has to be figured out. And so until we do that, yes, we will continue using fossil fuels as a source of carbon.
Okay, the next one is, what economical incentive would have a recycled plastic producer in comparison with those that use fossil fuel as petrochemical feed?
Yeah, so this is also another market-driven incentive by the brand owners. So, you know, you have companies like Nestle, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, right? And they want to be able to make claims on their packaging that either it's recyclable or made from recycled content in the case that it can't be recycled. And so that is what's really driving the production of plastic of recycled plastic. And there's a formal process put together by a company called ISCC, and I can never remember what that acronym stands for. But anyways, it's called a mass balance method or mass balance attribution. And so that's what allows these companies to take in the case of chemical recycling, to take in plastic waste and then convert it into what's considered practically virgin polyethylene or polypropylene again. When they do that, there's a custody transfer certificate that gets generated as part of this mass balance, and brand owners are willing to pay for that certificate, sometimes as much as they're paying for the plastic itself. And then that certificate is what allows them to make these claims about their packaging containing recycled content. So that is the economic incentive. It's totally market driven, and it's market driven by brand owners wanting to improve their reputation.
Yes. Here is a big question. What is the cost of this 250 agenda, and what would the formula for distributing this cost?
You know, I've seen this recently. I don't remember the number, but I can tell you it's significantly less than doing nothing. So there are some studies out there. I'm not horribly familiar with them, but I think there was one just released that do calculate the cost of getting to net zero 2050, but they also compare that to the economic damages, loss of GDP, loss of life that will occur in 2100 if we don't make net zero 2050. And they're orders of magnitude different. So it's just hard to think.
That's a political answer.
It's the trick is that, you know, you have to invest now for something that is not going to hurt you personally, right? Like, we're not going to be around. And so that's the difficult part of this.
Well, no us, but you know, our kids and grandkids are going to be around, so you have to worry
That's
about
right.
it. There's a question here. Say, have you ever dreamed of with a net zero TV ad? And if so, could you please share the main concept with us, please? That's from a public relation guy in our team.
Can't say that I have. I actually don't ever remember my dreams at night. I don't think I've had any daydreams either about a net zero TV ad. But that would be interesting. I mean, we have done sort of some ecosystem thoughts around what it would look like in 2050, you know, in the ecosystems of the future. A lot of it centers around this concept of an industrial hub. And so, you know, I live in Houston. So to take Houston as an example, we have a lot of hard to abate industry here. And we also have a lot of potential for carbon capture and storage. And so what the hub concept does is it combines that carbon capture and storage potential with hydrogen production, with carbon utilization, to create kind of this low carbon ecosystem that many industries benefit from.
The question, don't you think the global warming is an irreversible process?
Yes, which is why we have to stop it now. So yeah, I mean, if we get much past the 2 degrees, there's definitely some things that start to happen that are irreversible and will kind of exacerbate the whole situation. So yes, I do.
Okay, I don't have any more questions. Nobody have the courage to ask one in a live. So there is some people are asking me here. Oh, okay. If we can share your email or
Yes.
okay, I will. And
Well,
the
actually,
other, you have made an excellent presentation. You call our attention. There is only one thing I didn't like about your presentation.
okay.
You didn't put Venezuelan reserve in the reserve of the national company. And that's not only you, that's something that we are fighting against because Venezuela had a big potential and it's not showing in all of the statistics of all these big agencies.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I did notice that looking at that slide, how small Latin America was. And, you know, thinking that's Brazil and Venezuela, Guyana, there's a lot of countries there with big reserves. I was surprised by that as well.
that's because of the statistic of the big company. You know, they are not considering Venezuela in the energy matrix. Well, we will show you some work that some of the people in this group are doing, you know, that to show the opportunity for Venezuela. Okay, you put the, okay. So if anyone wants to ask a question to Jessica, if no, we close. Okay. So thank you, Jessica. Really, we appreciate it. It's an honor to have you here. We really have enjoyed your talk and your interaction. We hope. Oh, I got somebody wants to ask. One.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. It's an outstanding presentation that for first time has given me a real opportunity to really start believing that we can probably change, not for the sake of our children's and grandchildren's. And in that realm, I wonder if in your future exercises at Deloitte, have you ever thought that all these things about net zero could make, especially US and China, has to come together, really fix the issues, and stop fighting about sharing the world between democracy or dictatorships? And it's pretty much a geopolitical question, but I strongly believe from your thoughts and your evidences that that could be possible probably in the 2050s, because I believe that that is our most important concern these days regarding democracy, is that if you want to be a dictator, well, let be a dictator, but let us be democracies and let each country make their own decisions.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful side benefit of of solving the climate change problem, right? And making net zero 2050 a reality. Yeah, I mean, that would be a great world where these two companies cooperate and share technologies. So yeah, I mean, the decline of democracy has been real recently. It's kind of striking to think about.
Thank you. I'll ask you for your email.
It's in the chat.
Put it in the chat.
They put it in the chat. Well, Jessica, thank you. You are part of this team now, so you are invited every Friday if you can to our presentation. We get most of them are in Spanish, but I'm sure you can follow the technical ones. So I hope that we. Oh, wait a second, I got somebody else in the top. Adelante, Francisco. They don't let me close.
thank you, Jessica, for your excellent presentation. It was above expectation, and you are making think a lot. I don't know how to say in English that something. I don't know how somebody can explain it. That you está nombrando el mecate en la casa del ahorcado. No, I don't know how to say it.
You, you, I don't know how. Yeah, I don't know how the expression is in English. I don't know if anyone
It's something that you are talking about the rope in the house of the hanging ones. I don't know.
I don't know.
Oh,
You know
I
that
kind of
expression?
get what you're saying. Yeah. Yes.
So because
Universal.
some of us are working on conventional where we are not talking much about reserve, but we are coming from major companies or conventional where the big thing was the reserve. And what you are saying is true. Now in the present, like 8 years ago, still the company were talking about the reserve and so on. Now, even in the major companies, the presentation just about investment, rate of return, and how much are we are giving to our shareholders. So, and the other thing is, I was looking for a way that we know, what is coming, but we're still thinking there is a way that we can produce oil and at the same time not to contaminate the environment. So that's a hard bullet for us to swallow, even though we are doing our best. To get the message to all of us in the major companies right now, they're doing an effort, not just talking. In our goals, in our personal goals, we have to include this year what we are doing to lower the carbon emissions. So in doesn't have to be big, doesn't have to be to get a Nobel Prize, but we have to. Each one of the people that work in the company have to do something, start doing something. Also, all the companies starting to give incentive for the people that working toward the net zero emission. So the company are moving not at the rate that Jessica would like, but we are moving to that goal. Thank you again for your presentation.
There is a late
Thank
question.
you for inviting me, Francisco. I appreciate it.
Yeah. There is a late. We didn't see Karime. What happened with Karime, Francisco? There is a late question that just came in, Jessica. What I think is interesting is, do you think teens are talking about net zero?
As they do about tech. I assume by tech, maybe you mean video games and TikTok. I'm not exactly sure. I don't have any teens just yet. I have a 12-year-old. There definitely are some teens, as we saw from the climate protests that happened in 2020. I mean, most of that was led by teens. And there's actually some lawsuits around the world that have been filed by teens, against governments and companies for kind of, ruining their future Earth. So yeah, exactly. One teen started this discussion, Greta Thunberg. So yeah, I don't know that it's the common thing, but it's definitely happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got my grandkids, but they're not teens yet. So it would be interesting to know how they feel about this, as they feel about technology. Okay, but well, thank you again. Now we're going to